Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The problem of the many. A cloud drifts across the sky, its edges soft and undefined, fading gradually into the surrounding air. And a question arises that seems absurd at first. How many clouds are there? Is it one cloud, or is it many? And the answer is not as obvious as it seems, because the boundary of a cloud is vague, imprecise. And this vagueness creates a puzzle known as the problem of the many, a paradox about identity and indeterminacy that challenges our assumptions about what it means to be a single object. Consider the cloud more carefully. There is no sharp line where the cloud ends and the clear air begins. Instead, there is a gradient of water droplet density, thicker in some regions and thinner in others. And so we could draw the boundary of the cloud in many slightly different ways, each including or excluding a few droplets at the edges. And each such boundary defines a distinct aggregate of water molecules, and each aggregate has an equal claim to being the cloud. None is more privileged than any other, and so instead of one cloud there are millions of overlapping cloud candidates, each differing by just a few molecules, and all of them present at the same time in the same region of space. The problem generalizes to nearly every ordinary object. A cat sitting on a mat consists of trillions of cells and molecules, and the boundary of the cat is not precise. A few skin cells flake off constantly, a few hairs are loose, and so there are countless cat candidates, each differing slightly in which particles they include, and all of them have an equal claim to being the cat. And yet we do not say there are millions of cats sitting on the mat. We say there is one cat, and this creates a tension between our linguistic and conceptual practices and the metaphysical reality that seems to support vast multiplicity where we perceive unity. The paradox was articulated clearly by Peter Unger in the 1980s, though the underlying issue has roots in ancient philosophy, and it forces a choice between several unappealing options. One option is to accept that there really are many overlapping objects where we ordinarily think there is one. Millions of clouds and cats and tables all occupying nearly the same space, differing only by a few particles at the margins. Another option is to deny that ordinary objects exist at all, arguing that only fundamental particles or fields are real, and that clouds and cats are mere conventional designations we impose on complex arrangements of matter. And a third option is to embrace vagueness in the world itself, arguing that there is no fact of the matter about exactly which particles compose the cat, that the cat is a vague object with indeterminate boundaries. Though this raises difficult questions about the metaphysics of vagueness and whether reality itself can be indeterminate, or whether indeterminacy exists only in language and thought. Some philosophers argue that identity is conventional. That which aggregates counts as the cloud or the cat is determined by our practical interests and linguistic conventions rather than by objective facts, that there is no deep truth about where the cloud ends, only a question of what it is useful or natural to call a cloud in various contexts. And this view dissolves the paradox by denying that there is a genuine metaphysical problem, replacing it with a pragmatic question about how we choose to describe the world. Others insist that the problem of the many reveals a real difficulty in our ontology, that the world does not come pre-divided into discrete objects, that individuation is imposed by minds rather than discovered in nature, and that the apparent distinctness and unity of ordinary things is an artifact of perception and cognition rather than a feature of reality itself. The problem also connects to issues in vagueness and the Saurit's paradox, because if the boundaries of objects are vague, then questions like how many clouds are in the sky, or how many hairs must a person lose to become bald, have no determinate answers. And this suggests that much of our language is infected with indeterminacy, that most predicates do not have sharp extensions, and that the classical logical principle of bivalence, the idea that every statement is either true or false, may fail for a vast range of ordinary claims. The problem of the many lingers as a reminder that the world of discrete objects we navigate daily, a world of cats and clouds and people, may be a useful fiction, a conceptual overlay we impose on a reality that is far more fluid and indeterminate than it appears, and that the question of how many things there are may have no answer, or infinitely many answers, or no meaning at all depending on how we choose to carve up the continuous flux of matter and energy into countable, nameable entities. The prisoner's dilemma: why rational people choose worse outcomes. Two criminals are arrested, held in separate cells, cannot communicate, and the prosecutor offers each the same deal: testify against your partner and you go free while your partner gets 10 years, or stay silent, and if your partner also stays silent, you both get 1 year for a lesser charge. But if you stay silent and your partner testifies, then you get 10 years and your partner goes free. And if you both testify, you both get 5 years, and each prisoner must decide independently, without knowing what the other will choose. And the rational analysis is straightforward. From each prisoner's perspective, testifying dominates staying silent. If your partner stays silent, you get freedom by testifying versus 1 year by staying silent. And if your partner testifies, you get 5 years by testifying versus 10 years by staying silent. So regardless of what your partner does, you're better off testifying. And since both prisoners reason this way, both testify, both get 5 years, and yet if both had stayed silent, both would have gotten only 1 year. And so rational individual decision-making produces a collectively worse outcome. And this is the prisoner's dilemma, one of the most important concepts in game theory, a demonstration that individual rationality can lead to collective irrationality, that pursuing self-interest can harm everyone, including yourself. And the dilemma has applications across economics, politics, environmental policy, international relations, and reveals fundamental tensions between individual and collective good, between rationality and cooperation. Imagine being one of the prisoners, sitting in the cell, considering your options, and you reason: if I stay silent, I get either 1 year if my partner stays silent, or 10 years if my partner testifies. And if I testify, I get either freedom if my partner stays silent, or 5 years if my partner testifies. And comparing these, testifying is better in both cases, gives me a better outcome regardless of what my partner does. And this is a dominant strategy, a strategy that is best no matter what others do. And rationality seems to require choosing your dominant strategy. And so you testify, and your partner reasons the same way, also testifies, and you both get 5 years. And looking back, you realize that if you had both stayed silent, you would both be better off, would both get only 1 year, but you had no way to ensure your partner would stay silent, no way to trust. And without trust, the rational choice is to testify, even though cooperation would benefit both. The prisoner's dilemma demonstrates the difference between Nash equilibrium, a state where no player can improve by changing strategy unilaterally, and Pareto optimality, a state where no one can be made better off without making someone worse off. And in the dilemma, both testifying is a Nash equilibrium because neither prisoner can improve by switching to silence if the other is testifying. But both testifying is not Pareto optimal because both could be better off if both stayed silent. And this divergence between equilibrium and optimality is what creates the dilemma, shows that rational individual decision-making can get stuck in suboptimal outcomes, can fail to reach mutually beneficial cooperation. Visualize the dilemma as a payoff matrix. Rows represent prisoner A's choices, columns represent prisoner B's choices, and the cells show the outcomes. And the structure reveals that mutual cooperation yields better outcomes than mutual defection. But cooperation is risky, is vulnerable to exploitation, and defection is safe. Is the rational choice if you cannot trust your partner. And the dilemma captures this tension between cooperation and defection, between trusting others and protecting yourself. And this tension is ubiquitous, appears in countless real-world situations, from arms races to environmental agreements to business competition. The prisoner's dilemma has multiple variants: iterated prisoner's dilemma, where the same players interact repeatedly. An iteration changes the analysis because future interactions create incentives for cooperation, create opportunities for reputation building and retaliation, and strategies like tit for tat, where you cooperate initially and then mirror your partner's previous choice, perform well in iterated games, achieve cooperation through reciprocity. And this shows that repeated interaction can solve the dilemma, can enable cooperation even among self-interested rational agents. And real-world interactions are often repeated, are embedded in ongoing relationships, and this repetition facilitates cooperation, makes trust possible. Another variant is the multiplayer prisoner's dilemma, also called the tragedy of the commons, where many individuals face the choice between cooperating, restraining themselves for collective benefit, or defecting, pursuing individual benefit at collective cost. And examples include overfishing, pollution, climate change, where each individual's rational self-interest leads to collective disaster. And the tragedy of the commons shows that the prisoner's dilemma scales applies to large groups. And the problem is even harder with many players because coordination is more difficult, free riding is easier, and collective action problems arise, and solving these requires institutions, requires mechanisms for enforcement, for monitoring, for punishing defectors. And this is why societies have laws, have regulations, have enforcement mechanisms, because voluntary cooperation is difficult to sustain in large groups facing prisoners' dilemmas. The dilemma also has implications for moral philosophy, for understanding ethics and rationality, because the dilemma shows that rationality and morality can conflict, that the rational choice is to defect, to pursue self-interest, but the moral choice is to cooperate, to consider collective welfare. And this conflict challenges theories that equate rationality with morality, shows that purely self-interested rationality is insufficient for social welfare, requires supplementation with moral considerations, with concern for others, and various moral theories respond differently. Consequentialism might argue that the rational thing is to cooperate because outcomes matter. Contractarianism might argue that rational agents would agree to constraints on defection to avoid mutual harm. And virtue ethics might argue that cooperating reflects good character, even if not strictly rational, in narrow self-interest. One lesson from the prisoner's dilemma is the importance of institutions, of mechanisms that change incentives, that make cooperation rational, and laws that punish defection, contracts that bind parties, monitoring systems that detect cheating, all serve to solve prisoners' dilemmas. All transform situations where defection is rational into situations where cooperation is rational. And understanding the dilemma helps design better institutions, helps create systems where individual incentives align with collective good, and much of economics and political science concerns this problem, concerns how to structure institutions to promote cooperation in dilemma-like situations. Another lesson is the importance of communication, of trust building, of reputation, because in real-world dilemmas, players can communicate, can make commitments, can observe each other's behavior over time, and these factors facilitate cooperation, make it easier to coordinate on the cooperative outcome. And experiments show that allowing communication increases cooperation rates dramatically in prisoners' dilemmas. And this is why diplomacy matters, why negotiation matters, why building relationships matters, because these processes enable cooperation even when individual incentives favour defection. The prisoners sit in separate cells, cannot communicate, face the choice, and rational analysis drives them both to testify, to defect, even though cooperation would benefit both. And the dilemma reveals that rationality is not enough, that collective outcomes require more than individual optimization, require cooperation, trust, institutions, repeated interaction, communication, and the prisoner's dilemma remains one of the most important concepts in social science, a simple game that captures fundamental tensions in social life, that shows why cooperation is difficult, why self-interest can be self-defeating, why rational agents can fail to achieve optimal outcomes, and the dilemma persists as a permanent challenge to theories of rationality, to assumptions about markets and institutions, and as a tool for understanding why societies need laws, norms, enforcement, reputation, communication, all mechanisms that help solve dilemmas, that enable cooperation despite individual incentives to defect. And the prisoners testify, and both lose more than they needed to, and the dilemma endures. The 5 phenomenon, why motion is an illusion your brain creates. 2 lights flash in sequence. First, one light turns on and off. Then a moment later, another light nearby turns on and off. And yet what you perceive is not 2 separate flashes, but a single light moving from the first position to the second. Continuous motion where there is none. Smooth travel through space that never occurred. And this is the 5 phenomenon, discovered by Max Wertheimer in 1912. A fundamental illusion that reveals how the brain constructs the perception of motion, shows that motion is not simply detected from sensory input, but is created, is synthesized by the visual system from discrete static images. And the 5 phenomenon is the principle behind movies and television, where still frames flashed rapidly create the illusion of continuous motion, where characters seem to move smoothly when they are really just a sequence of frozen images. An understanding fee reveals that all motion perception involves construction, involves the brain interpreting changes and inferring movement. And motion is not a basic sensory property, but is a higher level interpretation, a perceptual inference that usually corresponds to reality, but can be fooled, can be triggered by appropriate sequences, even when nothing actually moves. And the 5 phenomenon stands as evidence that perception is actively constructed rather than passively recorded, that what we see is not simply what is there, but is what the brain interprets as being there. Imagine the experimental setup. 2 dots on a screen, separated by some distance, and the first dot appears briefly, vanishes, then after a short delay, the second dot appears, and if the timing and spacing are right, you do not see 2 sequential flashes, but see 1 dot moving from the first position to the second, sliding smoothly across the space between them. And this apparent motion, this phi, is so compelling that it feels exactly like real motion, indistinguishable phenomenologically from watching an object actually travel through space. And yet nothing moved. No object traversed the gap. There were only 2 separate stationary flashes, and the motion exists only in your perception, is constructed by your brain from the temporal sequence. The 5 phenomenon reveals that the visual system assumes continuity, assumes that when similar stimuli appear in nearby locations in rapid succession, they are probably the same object in motion. And this assumption is usually correct, is how motion in the real world works. Objects move continuously from place to place, and perceiving them as moving requires detecting this spatio-temporal pattern, and the visual system has evolved to detect this pattern efficiently, to infer motion from sequences of static retinal images, and phi exploits this mechanism, presents the pattern without the actual motion, and the brain responds as it normally does, constructs motion perception, and the illusion demonstrates that motion is not directly given in sensation, but is computed from changes in position over time. Visualize motion perception as involving motion detectors, neurons that respond to changes in position, to objects moving across the visual field, and these detectors can be activated by real motion, or by appropriate sequences of static stimuli. And phi activates these detectors, creates the neural signature of motion without actual motion. And the brain cannot distinguish between motion signals caused by real movement and motion signals caused by phi sequences. And so phi creates genuine motion perception, creates the subjective experience of seeing something move. And this shows that motion perception is a neural state that can be produced by different causes, by real motion or by well-timed sequences. And the experience is the same, regardless of cause. The phi phenomenon differs from other apparent motion phenomena, differs from beta motion, which is pure displacement without phenomenal movement, differs from stroboscopic motion, which is the specific type of motion seen in films, and phi is the perception of smooth, continuous movement, is the most compelling type of apparent motion. Most closely resembles real motion, and understanding the distinctions between different types of apparent motion reveals the complexity of the motion perception system, reveals that there are multiple mechanisms, multiple ways the brain computes motion, and phi is one specific mechanism, the mechanism that creates smooth motion perception from discrete temporal sequences. Gestalt psychologists like Wertheimer used phi to argue against elementalist theories of perception, against theories that said perception is built up from simple sensations combined according to associations, and phi shows that perception is not a sum of elements, not a combination of two flashes, but is a holistic interpretation, is motion that emerges from the relationship between flashes, and the whole is different from the sum of parts. And this Gestalt insight-shaped psychology influenced how perception came to be understood as involving organization and interpretation rather than simple sensation. And phi became a canonical example, a demonstration that perception is constructive, is synthetic, creates experiences that go beyond the sensory input. The phi phenomenon also has philosophical implications for understanding consciousness and qualia, because the motion you experience in phi is phenomenologically real, is indistinguishable from real motion, and yet no motion occurred in the stimulus. And this raises questions about the relationship between experience and reality, about whether experiences are always caused by corresponding physical events. And phi shows they are not, shows that the same experience can be caused by different physical processes, by real motion, or by sequential flashes. And this supports functionalist theories of consciousness, supports the view that conscious experiences are not tied to specific physical substrates, but are computational states that can be realized in multiple ways. One implication of phi for film and animation is that smooth motion can be created with relatively low frame rates. As long as frames are spaced appropriately in time and space, the phi phenomenon will create smooth motion perception. And this is why movies work at 24 frames per second, why television works at similar rates. The temporal gaps between frames are short enough that phi fills them in, creates continuous motion, and filmmakers exploit phi to create realistic movement, to make still images come alive. And understanding phi has been crucial to developing motion picture technology, to optimizing frame rates and timing. Another implication concerns perceptual boundaries, concerns what counts as seeing motion versus what counts as inferring motion, because phi feels like seeing motion, feels like direct perception, not like making an inference or having a belief. And yet phi is constructed, is synthesized by the brain from discrete inputs, and this raises questions about where perception ends and cognition begins, whether the boundary is sharp or gradual, whether there are clear distinctions between seeing and thinking, or whether perception shades continuously into cognition. And phi sits on this boundary, is simultaneously perceptual, immediate, and phenomenologically direct and cognitive, involving complex processing and interpretation. The lights flash in sequence and motion appears, smooth travel from first to second, and nothing moved, only the brain moved from sensing to interpreting, from input to output, and phi emerges, motion created from stillness, continuity created from discontinuity, and the phenomenon reveals the constructive nature of perception, reveals that experience is not a mirror of reality, but is a model constructed by the brain, a model that usually tracks reality accurately, but can be manipulated, can be triggered by artificial sequences, and the phi phenomenon endures as one of the foundational discoveries in perceptual psychology, a demonstration that motion is not given but is made, is not detected but is computed, and every motion you see, real or apparent, involves this same computation, this same construction, and phi makes the construction explicit, shows that what seems most immediate, most directly perceived, is actually mediated, is processed, is inferred, and motion is an illusion, a useful, accurate illusion usually, but an illusion nonetheless. And phi reveals this and the lights flash on. The paradox of tolerance, when being open-minded means destroying open-mindedness. A liberal society values tolerance, values the freedom to believe different things, to practice different religions, to hold different political views, to live in different ways. And this tolerance is seen as a virtue, as essential to freedom and democracy, as the foundation of peaceful coexistence in diverse societies. And the principle seems clear. We should tolerate all views and practices, should allow maximum freedom, should not suppress beliefs or ways of life just because we disagree with them. And yet a problem emerges, a paradox first articulated clearly by philosopher Karl Popper in 1945, which asks what a tolerant society should do when faced with intolerance, when confronted by movements that reject tolerance itself, that seek to destroy the open society and replace it with authoritarianism, that demand the right to spread hate and silence opposition. And if the tolerant society tolerates these intolerant movements, if it grants them freedom to organize and spread their views, then the intolerant movements will eventually gain power and destroy tolerance itself, will shut down free speech, will persecute minorities, will end democracy, and the tolerant society will have tolerated itself out of existence. And this is the paradox of tolerance, the recognition that unlimited tolerance leads to the destruction of tolerance, that to preserve a tolerant society, it may be necessary to be intolerant toward intolerance, to refuse to tolerate those who would destroy tolerance. Imagine a democracy where free speech is protected, where all political views are allowed, where movements can organize and campaign and attempt to win power through elections. And now, imagine a fascist movement that explicitly rejects democracy, that promises to seize power and end elections and establish dictatorship. And this movement uses the freedoms of the democratic system to grow, uses free speech to spread propaganda, uses freedom of assembly to recruit followers, uses democratic procedures to gain seats in parliament, and at each stage the democratic society faces a choice. Do we tolerate this movement? Do we allow it to continue operating within the system, even though its goal is to destroy the system? Or do we suppress it? Do we ban the movement, arrest its leaders, prevent it from spreading its message? And if we suppress it, are we betraying our own principles? Are we becoming intolerant ourselves? And if we do not suppress it, are we complicit in our own destruction? Are we naive? Are we allowing democracy to commit suicide? Popper's answer was that we should not tolerate the intolerant, that tolerance is not a suicide pact, that a society that wishes to remain tolerant must be willing to defend itself against movements that seek to destroy tolerance, and this means that tolerance has limits, that it does not extend to those who would abuse it to eliminate tolerance. And Popper acknowledged that this is paradoxical, that the tolerant society must practice intolerance, must suppress certain views, must limit freedom in order to preserve freedom. But he argued that this is necessary, that the alternative is the death of tolerance, and history supports this. Societies that tolerated fascist movements in the 1920s and 1930s saw those movements seize power and establish brutal dictatorships. And the lesson is that tolerance must be defended, that it cannot be absolute, that there are views and movements that cannot be accommodated within a free society because their goal is to end freedom. But this creates difficult questions about where to draw the line, about which views count as intolerably intolerant, about who decides, about what methods of suppression are legitimate. Because if we ban every movement that seems threatening, if we suppress every view that makes us uncomfortable, then we are no longer a tolerant society. We have become the oppressors. We have done the work of the intolerant for them. And so the paradox is not fully resolved by saying we should not tolerate intolerance, because we need principles to determine what counts as intolerance. What level of threat justifies suppression, and whether suppression means banning speech, banning organizations, arresting people, or merely refusing to engage, refusing to give platforms, refusing to treat intolerant views as legitimate options in public debate. Visualize a spectrum of intolerance. On one end are views that are merely offensive or unpopular, views that challenge prevailing norms, views that make some people uncomfortable. And these views, even if we find them objectionable, should be tolerated in a free society, should be allowed to be expressed and debated, because tolerance means accepting that people will hold views we dislike. And suppressing offensive views is censorship, is the tyranny of the majority, is the opposite of the tolerance we claim to value. And on the other end of the spectrum are movements that actively seek to destroy democratic institutions, that incite violence, that organize to strip rights from minorities, that threaten the basic conditions of a free society. And these movements, Popper argues, need not be tolerated, can be suppressed to protect the tolerant society. But the middle of the spectrum is murky, filled with cases where reasonable people disagree about whether a movement or view crosses the line. And this is where the paradox bites hardest, where we must make judgments without clear rules, where any decision risks either tolerating too much and allowing intolerance to grow, or suppressing too much and becoming intolerant ourselves. Some philosophers argue that the paradox can be resolved through procedural rules, through formal commitments to democratic processes. A tolerant society tolerates all views that accept the democratic framework, that agree to compete peacefully for power, that accept the results of elections and respect the rights of others. But it does not tolerate movements that reject these procedures, that seek power through violence or intimidation, that refuse to accept electoral defeat. And this procedural approach provides a clear line. Tolerance extends to those who play by the rules, not to those who seek to overturn the rules. But critics note that even this approach involves substantive value judgments, because the democratic framework itself embodies values like equality and freedom. And so we are saying we tolerate all views except those that reject our core values. And this is not neutral tolerance, but partisan tolerance, tolerance of a specific range of views that we have already deemed acceptable. Others argue that the solution involves distinguishing between tolerating views and tolerating actions, that a truly tolerant society allows people to hold and express any beliefs, but does not allow them to act on beliefs that harm others. So expressing racist views might be tolerated, but discriminatory actions are not. Advocating for dictatorship might be tolerated, but attempting a coup is not. And this distinction seems to preserve free thought and speech while preventing harm, but it faces difficulties because speech can cause harm, hate speech can incite violence, propaganda can radicalize people, and drawing the line between harmless expression and harmful action is not straightforward. And some argue that by the time intolerant movements act, it may be too late, that tolerant societies must suppress intolerant speech before it metastasizes into intolerant action. The paradox also has a psychological dimension, because tolerating intolerance is emotionally difficult, requires accepting that people will spread views you find abhorrent, will organize against values you hold dear, will seek to undermine the society you want to preserve. and this acceptance is painful, creates tension, and there is a constant temptation to suppress, to silence, to refuse to tolerate, and distinguishing between legitimate suppression of genuine threats and illegitimate censorship of mere disagreement requires judgment, requires resisting the urge to label all opposing views as intolerable, requires humility about our own fallibility, and these are difficult virtues to maintain, especially in polarized times when every political disagreement feels existential. The tolerant society stands at the edge, welcoming diverse views, protecting freedom, and watching as intolerant movements test the boundaries, push the limits, demand the right to destroy the very system that protects them. And the society must decide, must draw a line, must say some things cannot be tolerated, some movements cannot be accommodated. And in drawing that line, the society becomes less than perfectly tolerant, accepts that tolerance has limits, that the open society must defend itself. And the paradox does not disappear, but is managed, lived with, navigated through judgment and vigilance. And Popper's warning echoes, unlimited tolerance leads to the disappearance of tolerance, and so tolerance must be limited, must exclude those who would destroy it. And this is not a betrayal of tolerance, but its preservation. Not a contradiction, but a recognition that all principles have boundaries, that values must be defended, and that the truly tolerant society is one that tolerates everything except intolerance. And the paradox remains, uncomfortable and unresolved, a permanent feature of liberal democracy, a reminder that freedom is fragile, that it must be actively maintained, and that tolerance for all its virtues is not enough by itself, must be supplemented with vigilance, with judgment, with the willingness to say no, to draw lines, to defend the open society against those who would close it. And the tension persists, always present, always requiring balance, and the paradox endures. The rubber hand illusion, when a fake hand becomes yours. A person sits at a table, their real hand hidden from view behind a screen, and a rubber hand, a realistic prosthetic, is placed in front of them where they can see it. And the experimenter uses two paintbrushes, simultaneously stroking the hidden real hand and the visible rubber hand in synchrony. The same strokes at the same times on corresponding locations. And after several minutes, something strange happens. The person begins to feel as though the rubber hand is their hand, feels the touch sensations as coming from the rubber hand rather than from the hidden real hand. And when the experimenter threatens the rubber hand, moves a hammer toward it, as if to strike, the person flinches, shows a physiological stress response, reacts as though the rubber hand is in danger. And this is the rubber hand illusion, discovered by Botvinnik and Cohen in 1998. A phenomenon demonstrating that body ownership, the sense that a body part is yours, is not fixed but is flexible, can be manipulated, can be extended to objects that are not part of your body. And the illusion reveals that the sense of body ownership is constructed by the brain through integration of visual, tactile, and proprioceptive information. And when these signals are consistent, when vision shows a hand being touched in the same way, and at the same time as tactile signals indicate your hand is being touched, the brain infers that the seen hand is your hand, updates the body representation, and the rubber hand is incorporated into the body schema. And the rubber hand illusion has profound implications for understanding embodiment, for understanding the sense of self, for prosthetic design, and for recognizing that the boundaries of the self are not fixed but are dynamic and constructed. Imagine the subjective experience. You watch the rubber hand, see the paintbrush stroke it, and simultaneously feel strokes on your real hidden hand. And at first the rubber hand is clearly not yours, is obviously a fake. But as the synchronous stroking continues, something shifts. The rubber hand begins to feel like it could be yours, begins to feel connected, and after several minutes, the feeling is strong. The rubber hand feels like part of your body, and when you are asked to close your eyes and point to where your real hand is, your pointing is shifted toward the rubber hand. you mislocalize your real hand, place it closer to the rubber hand than it actually is. And this proprioceptive drift shows that the body representation has been updated, has incorporated the rubber hand. And the illusion is not just a belief, but is a genuine perceptual shift, a change in how your body feels and where it feels located. The rubber hand illusion demonstrates multisensory integration, shows that the brain combines information from different senses to construct a coherent representation of the body. And when visual, tactile, and proprioceptive signals are consistent, they are attributed to the same body part, and the brain updates the body schema accordingly. And the rubber hand, despite being visibly fake, is integrated because the signals are consistent. Vision and touch agree, and the brain prioritizes consistency over implausibility, treats the consistent signals as evidence of body ownership, and the illusion reveals that body ownership is not simply given by innate body knowledge, but is actively maintained through continuous multisensory integration. And the boundaries of the body are flexible, can be extended or contracted depending on sensory evidence. Visualize the body schema as a dynamic map, a neural representation of the body's configuration and boundaries. And this map is constantly updated based on sensory input, is adjusted to reflect current body state. And the rubber hand illusion shows that the map can be manipulated, can be made to include external objects, if the right sensory conditions are met. And this flexibility is adaptive, allows the body schema to incorporate tools and prosthetics, allows extension of the sense of embodiment beyond biological boundaries. And the illusion demonstrates this flexibility, shows that a rubber hand can be treated as real, can be incorporated into the body schema, can evoke proprioceptive shifts and emotional responses. The rubber hand illusion has practical applications for prosthetic design, for helping amputees incorporate artificial limbs, for creating prosthetics that feel like part of the body rather than like external tools, and understanding the conditions that produce the illusion, the need for synchronous multisensory stimulation, informs how prosthetics should provide feedback, how they should integrate visual and tactile signals. And the illusion has been used therapeutically, has been adapted to treat phantom limb pain, to help amputees resolve conflicts between visual evidence of absence and proprioceptive evidence of presence, and the techniques developed from studying the illusion have real clinical value. The illusion also has implications for understanding the self, for recognizing that the sense of body ownership is not a simple direct given but is a constructed representation, is inferred from sensory evidence, and the self, at least the bodily self, is flexible, is not fixed by biological boundaries, and this challenges naive views of the self as a simple unity, as transparently given, and supports views that the self is constructed, is a model built by the brain, and the model can be manipulated, can include or exclude body parts depending on sensory evidence. And the rubber hand illusion shows this manipulation directly, shows that body ownership can be experimentally induced for fake limbs. And this raises questions about personal identity, about what makes a body part yours, about whether ownership is determined by biological connection or by sensory integration, and the illusion suggests the latter. One variant of the rubber hand illusion uses virtual reality, uses computer-generated hands that can be manipulated more precisely than rubber hands, can change appearance, can violate physical constraints, and virtual embodiment studies have shown that people can experience ownership of virtual bodies, can incorporate digital hands into their body schema. And this has applications for VR design, for creating immersive experiences, for understanding how to make virtual avatars feel like real bodies, and the principles discovered through the rubber hand illusion extend to virtual embodiment, show that the same multisensory integration mechanisms apply, and synchronous visuotactile stimulation produces ownership of virtual limbs just as it does for rubber limbs. Another variant explores whether the illusion extends beyond hands, whether legs or whole bodies can be incorporated, and studies have shown that full body illusions are possible, that people can experience ownership of entire mannequin bodies or virtual avatars when appropriate multisensory stimulation is provided. And these full body illusions demonstrate that body ownership is global, applies to the entire body representation, and can be manipulated systematically. And the flexibility of body ownership is even greater than the rubber hand illusion alone suggests, extends to whole body reconfiguration. And this has implications for understanding disorders of body ownership, for understanding phantom limbs and body integrity identity disorder, and for developing therapeutic interventions. The rubber hand sits on the table, fake and obvious, and yet after synchronous stroking, it feels real, feels like part of the body, and the person flinches when it is threatened, responds emotionally and physiologically as though their real hand is in danger. And the illusion reveals that body ownership is constructed, is inferred from multisensory consistency, is flexible and dynamic, and the boundaries of the self are not fixed but are continuously updated based on sensory evidence. And the rubber hand illusion endures as one of the most striking demonstrations in cognitive neuroscience, a phenomenon that challenges assumptions about embodiment, that reveals the constructed nature of the bodily self, and that shows that even the most basic sense, the sense of which body parts are yours, is not simply given but is actively maintained through brain processes that can be fooled, can be manipulated, and the rubber hand becomes real, becomes incorporated, and the illusion persists. The sleeping beauty problem. A woman volunteers for an unusual experiment in probability and subjective credence, an experiment that will test how she should reason about her own situation when her memory has been manipulated. And the setup is as follows. On Sunday she's put to sleep, and a fair coin is flipped. If the coin lands heads, she is awakened on Monday, interviewed briefly, and then the experiment ends. But if the coin lands tails, she is awakened on Monday, interviewed, given a drug that erases her memory of the Monday awakening, put back to sleep, awakened again on Tuesday, interviewed again, and then the experiment ends. And the crucial feature is that whenever she is awakened, she cannot tell whether it is Monday or Tuesday, cannot tell whether the coin landed heads or tails. She knows only that she is awake and being interviewed. And the question posed to philosophers and decision theorists is this: when Sleeping Beauty is awakened and interviewed, what should her credence be that the coin landed heads? What probability should she assign to heads given her situation and her knowledge? The problem divides respondents into two camps, the halfers and the thirders, and each position has compelling arguments. Yet they reach opposite conclusions, creating a paradox that reveals deep tensions in how we think about probability, information, and self-locating belief. The halfers argue that Sleeping Beauty should maintain her prior credence of one half, because the coin is fair and nothing she learns upon awakening provides evidence about how it landed. She knew before the experiment that she would be awakened at least once, and being awakened is guaranteed regardless of the coin outcome, and so the awakening provides no new information, no reason to update her probability, and therefore she should stick with one half. And this reasoning seems straightforward, seems to respect the principle that probabilities should only change when new evidence is acquired, and being awakened is not new evidence because it was certain to happen. The thirders argue that Sleeping Beauty should assign credence 1/3 to heads, because there are three possible awakening situations: heads Monday, tails Monday, and tails Tuesday. And from her perspective, upon awakening, these three situations are indistinguishable. She cannot tell which one she is in, and by a principle of indifference among indistinguishable possibilities, she should assign equal probability to each, 1/3 to each. And since heads corresponds to only one of these situations, heads Monday, while tails corresponds to 2, tails Monday, and tails Tuesday, her credence in heads should be 1/3, and her credence in tails should be 2/3. And this reasoning seems to respect the information that if the coin landed tails, she is twice as likely to be awakened, that her current awakening is more probable under tails than under heads. And this should shift her credence toward tails. The disagreement between halfers and thirders reflects a deeper question about what credences represent and how they should be updated. Halfers tend to interpret credence as tracking objective chance, the physical probability of the coin flip, which is 1/2 and does not change based on Sleeping Beauty's subjective situation, while thirders interpret credence as tracking epistemic probability, the rational degree of belief given all available information, including self-locating information. And from this perspective, Sleeping Beauty's situation upon awakening is evidence that favours tails, because tails generates more awakenings and therefore more situations in which she finds herself awakened and uncertain. The problem becomes more vivid when decision-theoretic stakes are introduced. Suppose Sleeping Beauty is offered a bet each time she is awakened, a bet that pays if heads and costs if tails, and she must decide whether to accept. And now the question is what odds she should demand to make the bet fair. And halfers say she should demand even odds, 1-1, because the coin is fair, while thirders say she should demand 2-1 odds in favour of tails, because she is more likely to be betting in a tails scenario where she will lose. And when the bet is actually offered and payoffs are calculated, the thirder strategy performs better, winning more money on average. And this seems to vindicate the thirder position, to show that 1/3 is the correct credence for guiding decisions. Yet halfers respond that this merely shows a difference between epistemic credence and decision-making strategy, that the correct probability of heads is still 1/2, even if the correct betting strategy involves different odds. The Sleeping Beauty problem also raises questions about the reference class problem, the question of which group of situations Sleeping Beauty should consider herself a random member of. Should she think of herself as randomly selected from the set of coin flips, in which case heads and tails are equally likely, or should she think of herself as randomly selected from the set of awakening events, in which case tails is twice as likely, and different reference classes lead to different probabilities, and there is no obviously correct way to choose between them. The problem connects to issues about personal identity and indexical information, information about who or when or where you are, because Sleeping Beauty, upon awakening, does not learn any new didicto information, any new information about how the world is. She already knew that she would be awakened at least once, but she does gain new desi information, new information about which temporal slice of herself she currently is, new information about her location in time. And the question is whether this indexical information should change her credences, whether learning that you're currently experiencing an awakening provides evidence about the coin, even if you knew that you would experience at least one awakening. Some philosophers propose middle positions, arguing that different notions of probability are at play, and that the halfer and thirder answers are both correct relative to different interpretive frameworks, or that the question is underspecified and cannot be answered without further stipulations about what is being asked. But these conciliatory approaches satisfy neither halfers nor thirders, each of whom believes their answer is the uniquely correct one. The problem has spawned an enormous literature, with variants and extensions testing different aspects of the puzzle, versions with different probabilities for the coin, versions with different numbers of awakenings, versions where Sleeping Beauty is told what day it is, and each variant sharpens the intuitions or reveals new complications, and the debate shows no signs of resolution. Conferences are held, papers are written, arguments are refined, and the community remains divided. And this persistence suggests that the Sleeping Beauty problem may not have a single correct answer, may instead reveal an ambiguity or indeterminacy in the concept of rational credence, a place where our intuitions pull in different directions, and no amount of formalization fully captures what is at stake. Sleeping Beauty lies in the laboratory, awakened and interviewed, uncertain whether it is Monday or Tuesday, uncertain whether the coin landed heads or tails, and she must assign a probability, must decide what to believe. And the philosophers watching cannot agree on what she should say, cannot agree on whether her credence should be 1/2 or 1/3, and the experiment continues. The coin is flipped again and again. Sleeping Beauty is awakened and interviewed again and again, and the paradox persists, a puzzle that seems simple, a question about a coin flip and some awakenings, yet contains within it deep disagreements about probability, evidence, identity, and the nature of rational belief. And no solution has won consensus, no argument has settled the debate, and Sleeping Beauty remains caught between halfers and thirders, between two ways of understanding her situation, two ways of reasoning about uncertainty, and perhaps there is no fact of the matter, no correct answer, only different frameworks that give different results. And the choice between them reflects philosophical commitments rather than mathematical necessity, and the problem endures, a touchstone in debates about probability, a puzzle that refuses to be solved, a question that generates endless discussion, yet no agreement, and Sleeping Beauty wakes and wonders, and assigns her credence, and the debate continues, without end, without resolution, a permanent fixture in the landscape of philosophical paradoxes. The St. Petersburg Paradox. A casino offers a game with a simple rule. A fair coin is flipped repeatedly until it lands tails, and the player receives a payout that depends on the number of flips. If tails appears on the first flip, the payout is $2. If tails appears on the second flip, the payout is $4. If on the third flip, $8, and so on, doubling with each additional flip. And the question posed by the mathematician Daniel Bernoulli in 1738 is this: how much should a rational person be willing to pay to play this game? What is the fair price for a ticket? And the expected value calculation gives a shocking answer. The expected value is infinite, because the probability of tails appearing on the first flip is 1/2, and the payout is $2, contributing $1 to the expected value. And the probability of tails appearing on the second flip is 1/4, and the payout is $4, contributing another $1, and this pattern continues forever, each outcome contributing $1 to the expected value. And since there are infinitely many outcomes, the expected value is infinite. And yet no reasonable person would pay a large sum to play this game, let alone an infinite amount. And this gap between the infinite expected value and the finite amount people are actually willing to pay is the St. Petersburg Paradox, a puzzle that challenged the theory that rational agents maximize expected value and led to the development of expected utility theory and the concept of diminishing marginal utility. The paradox reveals that expected value, calculated as the sum of each outcome's value multiplied by its probability, may not be the appropriate guide for decision-making, because expected value treats dollars linearly, assumes that $10 is worth exactly 10 times as much as $1, and that $1 million is worth exactly 1,000,000 times as much. But this does not capture how people actually value money. For most people, the value of money exhibits diminishing marginal utility. The first dollar is worth more in terms of welfare than the second dollar, which is worth more than the third, and so on. And $1 million does not provide 1,000,000 times as much satisfaction as $1. And when utility, rather than dollar value, is used to calculate expectations, the St. Petersburg paradox can be resolved. Because even though the dollar payouts grow without bound, the utility of those payouts may converge to a finite value, and so the expected utility of the game is finite. And a rational agent should be willing to pay at most that finite expected utility to play. Daniel Bernoulli proposed that utility is logarithmic in wealth, that the utility of having X dollars is proportional to the logarithm of X. And under this assumption, the expected utility of the St. Petersburg game is finite, and the fair price to play is modest, a few dollars perhaps, in line with what people are actually willing to pay. And this resolution saved the principle of expected utility maximization, showing that the paradox arises not from a flaw in decision theory, but from using the wrong measure of value, from confusing money with utility. And Bernoulli's insight laid the groundwork for modern economics and decision theory, which routinely assume that utility is concave in wealth, that people are risk-averse, that they prefer a certain outcome to a gamble with the same expected value, and that this risk aversion reflects diminishing marginal utility. But the St. Petersburg paradox has deeper layers, because even the expected utility resolution can be challenged. Mathematicians have constructed super St. Petersburg games where the payouts grow so rapidly that expected utility is also infinite, even under logarithmic utility or any concave utility function. For instance, if the payout on flip n is not 2 to the power of n dollars, but 2 to the power of 2 to the power of n, or some even faster growing function, then expected utility under any reasonable utility function will be infinite. And so the paradox reappears, and this suggests that the problem is not merely about the choice of value function, but about how to handle infinite or unbounded expectations. And some decision theorists argue that games with infinite expected value or utility are ill-defined, that they fall outside the domain of expected utility theory, that the theory was never meant to handle such cases and should not be faulted for failing to do so. Others propose alternative decision theories, bounded utility functions where utility approaches a maximum, as wealth increases so that no payout, however large, has infinite utility, and under such functions, all expected utilities are finite. And the paradox is avoided, or they propose maximum principles where the agent focuses on the worst possible outcome, or they appeal to considerations of probability and belief, arguing that rational agents should not assign positive probability to arbitrarily unlikely events, that there is some threshold below which probabilities are treated as zero, and this truncation of the probability distribution renders expected values finite. The paradox also raises questions about the feasibility of the game, because no casino could actually pay out arbitrarily large sums. The maximum payout is limited by the casino's resources, and once this limit is imposed, the expected value becomes finite, and the paradox dissolves. But this response feels unsatisfying, like avoiding the problem rather than solving it, because the paradox is meant to be a thought experiment about rational decision-making, not a practical question about casino economics. And thought experiments should not be dismissed simply because they involve idealizations. The St. Petersburg paradox connects to debates about rationality and the nature of value, about whether rationality requires maximizing expected utility or whether other principles should guide decision-making, about whether value is unbounded or whether there are limits to how much anything can be worth, about how to handle uncertainty and risk, especially when probabilities are very small and payoffs are very large. And these questions have implications far beyond gambling, for insurance, for investment, for policy decisions involving catastrophic risks like pandemics or asteroid impacts, where the probabilities are tiny, but the potential costs or benefits are enormous. And the paradox shows that expected value reasoning can give counterintuitive or unhelpful guidance in such cases, that we may need other frameworks, other ways of thinking about decision-making under extreme uncertainty. The coin is flipped, tails appears eventually, the game ends, the payout is made, and the player receives some finite amount, usually small, rarely large, almost never enormous, and the expected value calculated before the game began was infinite. But this infinity is never realized, never paid out, never experienced, and so the paradox asks whether infinite expected value is meaningful, whether it should guide decisions, whether a rational agent should treat an infinite expectation differently from a very large finite one. And the answers are not obvious, not settled, not agreed upon, and the St. Petersburg paradox remains a puzzle, a test case for decision theory, a challenge to the principle of expected value maximization, a reminder that infinity is strange, that unbounded sequences create problems, that mathematical idealizations can clash with practical intuitions, and that the gap between theory and behavior, between what agents should do according to formal models and what they actually do, reveals something important about the limits of rationality, the role of psychology, the nature of value, and the difficulty of making decisions in a world where outcomes can vary wildly, where probabilities can be minuscule, and where the mathematics of expectation, taken to its logical extreme, produces results that seem absurd, untenable, impossible to act on, and the paradox endures, studied in classrooms, debated in journals, unresolved despite centuries of attention, a permanent fixture in the philosophy of probability, economics, and decision theory. The symbol grounding problem. Why computers never know what words really mean. A computer system is given a dictionary, a complete dictionary that defines every word in terms of other words, and the system can look up any word, follow the chains of definitions, process the relationships between symbols, and the system appears to understand language, can answer questions by manipulating symbols according to rules, can translate between languages by mapping symbols to symbols, can even generate coherent text by following patterns learned from training data. And yet philosopher Stephen Harnad asks a crucial question. Does the system understand what any symbol means? Does it know what the words refer to? Or is it merely shuffling meaningless tokens according to syntactic rules? And this is the symbol grounding problem. The question of how symbols, whether in computers or in minds, acquire meaning, how they connect to the world, how they come to be about something rather than being mere formal marks. And the problem challenges purely symbolic theories of cognition, challenges the idea that thinking is symbol manipulation, and points to the need for grounding, for connecting symbols to non-symbolic experiences, to perceptions and actions, to interactions with the world that give symbols their meaning. Imagine looking up the word zebra in the dictionary, and the dictionary says a zebra is a striped equine mammal, and you look up striped and find marked with parallel bands, and you look up equine and find relating to horses, and you look up mammal and find warm-blooded vertebrate animal, and you can continue this process indefinitely, following chains of definitions, symbol to symbol to symbol, and if you have never seen a zebra, never encountered stripes or horses or animals, then all these definitions are empty, are just more words whose meanings you do not grasp, and the whole dictionary becomes a closed system of symbols referring to other symbols with no connection to reality. And this is the situation of a purely symbolic computer system. It has access to definitions, to relationships between symbols, but it has no grounding, no connection to the real zebras and stripes and horses that the symbols are supposed to be about. The symbol grounding problem challenges strong AI, the claim that implementing the right program, manipulating symbols according to the right rules, is sufficient for understanding, is sufficient for genuine cognition, and Harnad argues that symbol manipulation alone is not enough, that understanding requires grounding, requires that at least some symbols be connected to non-symbolic experiences, to sensory inputs and motor outputs, to perceptions of the world and actions in the world, and these grounded symbols can then give meaning to other symbols through their relationships. And a hybrid system, with both grounded and symbolic components, can achieve genuine understanding, but a purely symbolic system cannot, remains forever trapped in a web of meaningless symbols, playing symbol games without comprehension. Visualize two systems. One is a person who has seen zebras, has perceived their stripes, has distinguished them from horses, And when this person uses the word zebra, it is grounded in these experiences, refers to real animals encountered in the world. And the other system is a computer that has only manipulated symbols, has processed text containing the word zebra, has learned statistical patterns, but has never perceived a zebra, never interacted with one. And when this system uses zebra, it is ungrounded, refers to nothing beyond other symbols. And Harnad's claim is that these two uses are fundamentally different, that the person understands what zebra means, and the computer does not. And the difference is grounding, is connection to non-symbolic reality. The symbol grounding problem connects to arguments in philosophy of mind, like Searle's Chinese room, which argues that syntax is not sufficient for semantics, that manipulating symbols, according to rules, does not produce understanding, and both arguments challenge computational theories of mind, challenge the idea that cognition is just symbol manipulation, and both point to the need for something more, something beyond symbols. Though they disagree about what that something is, Searle appeals to intrinsic intentionality and consciousness, while Harnad appeals to sensorimotor grounding and interaction with the world. One response to the symbol grounding problem accepts it and argues that AI systems need embodiment, need sensors and actuators, need to interact with the physical world, and recent developments in robotics and embodied AI pursue this approach, creating systems that learn through perception and action, that ground their symbols in sensory experience. And these systems can associate words with visual features, can learn that zebra refers to things with certain visible properties, and this grounding, even if limited compared to human grounding, provides a foundation for meaning that purely symbolic systems lack. Another response challenges the problem, argues that grounding is not necessary for meaning, that symbol systems can have meaningful representations through their functional roles, through how symbols are used in inference and reasoning, and meaning is holistic, depends on the entire network of symbols and their relationships. And a sufficiently complex symbolic system can have meaningful representations even without grounding in perception and action. And this response defends computationalism, defends the idea that cognition is symbol manipulation, and denies that something extra, something beyond symbols, is needed for genuine understanding. A third response distinguishes between different kinds of meaning, between dictionary meaning, which can be captured symbolically, and grounded meaning, which requires connection to experience, and argues that both kinds exist. Both are legitimate, and purely symbolic systems can have dictionary meaning even if they lack grounded meaning, and for many purposes dictionary meaning is sufficient, is all that is needed for tasks like translation or information retrieval. And so the symbol grounding problem, while real, is less threatening than it appears, shows limits on what purely symbolic systems can do, but does not show that such systems are meaningless or useless. The symbol grounding problem also has implications for language learning, for understanding how children acquire meaning, because children do not learn language from dictionaries, do not master symbols by relating them to other symbols, but learn by associating words with experiences, by hearing zebra while seeing zebras, by using words in context, by grounding language in perception and action. And this grounding happens early, provides a foundation of basic concepts, and more abstract concepts are built on this foundation through symbol-symbol relationships. And so human language combines grounding and symbolic structure, uses both perceptual and abstract meaning, and neither alone is sufficient. The computer processes text, generates responses, manipulates symbols with impressive fluency, and yet the question remains whether it understands anything, whether its symbols mean anything beyond their formal relationships, and Harnad's symbol grounding problem suggests not, suggests that without grounding in non-symbolic experience, the symbols are empty, are syntactic objects without semantic content. And the problem persists as a challenge to AI, as a question about what would be needed for machines to genuinely understand, whether symbol manipulation supplemented with machine learning is enough, or whether something else, something like embodied interaction with the world, is necessary. And the problem remains unresolved, remains debated, remains a permanent feature of discussions about AI and cognition, about meaning and understanding, about the relationship between symbols and what they represent. And the symbol grounding problem endures as a reminder that meaning is not just a matter of relationships between symbols, but requires connection to a non-symbolic ground, requires that symbols hook onto the world, requires that language touch reality, and whether computers can achieve this grounding, whether they can move beyond symbol manipulation to genuine understanding, remains one of the central questions in artificial intelligence and philosophy of mind. The third man argument: why Plato's theory spawns infinite forms. A philosopher named Aristotle attacks his teacher Plato's theory of forms, attacks the idea that universal properties like tallness or humanity exist as perfect eternal forms in a separate realm, and Aristotle constructs a devastating objection, an argument that shows Plato's theory generates an infinite regress, creates an endless multiplication of forms, and the argument is called the third man argument, named after an example involving men, and the argument goes as follows. Plato says that multiple tall men are tall because they participate in the form of tallness. They resemble the form. They share something with the eternal perfect tall. And now Aristotle asks, if multiple men and the form of man are all men in some sense, then what explains their similarity? What makes them all instances of manhood? And Plato's theory requires positing another form, a second form of man that the first form and the particular men all participate in. And this second form explains why the first form and the particulars are all men. But now we have the second form and the particular men and the first form, and these are all men. And what explains their similarity? And Plato's theory requires a third form, a third man, and this generates infinite regress, infinite forms, and the explanation never grounds, never stops, never reaches a final form that explains all similarity. And this is the third man argument, a reductio ad absurdum of Plato's theory of forms, showing that the theory is self-defeating, generates infinite regress, and cannot explain what it was designed to explain. Imagine the structure. Multiple particular tall men exist. Call them Tom and Tim and Ted, and they are all tall, and Plato explains this by saying they all participate in the form of tallness. Call it Form 1, and Form 1 is the perfect tall, is what makes Tom and Tim and Ted tall, and they are tall by resembling Form 1. But now notice that Tom and Tim and Ted and Form 1 are all tall, all share the property of tallness, and by Plato's own reasoning, this similarity requires explanation, requires a form that they all participate in. And so we need Form 2, a second form of tallness that explains why Form 1 and the particular men are all tall. And now we have Form 1 and Form 2 and the particular men, all tall. And this similarity requires explanation, requires Form 3. And the regress continues infinitely. And tallness is not explained by a single form, but by an infinite hierarchy of forms. And this infinite hierarchy is vicious, is problematic, because each form was supposed to explain similarity, was supposed to ground the property, but the grounding never completes, requires further forms endlessly. The third man argument reveals a deep problem with Plato's theory. The problem is that forms are supposed to explain why particulars have properties, but forms themselves have properties. The form of tallness is tall, the form of beauty is beautiful. And if forms have the properties they explain, then they fall under their own domain, are subject to the same explanation they provide. And this creates regress, creates the need for higher order forms. And the regress is vicious because it undermines the explanatory role of forms, shows that forms do not actually explain anything, do not provide ultimate ground. And Aristotle uses this argument to reject Plato's separate forms, to argue that forms must exist in particulars, not in a separate realm, and that resemblance is primitive, not explained by participation in forms. Visualize the regress as a ladder. At the bottom are particular tall men. At the next rung is Form 1 that explains their tallness. At the next rung is Form 2 that explains why Form 1 and the men are all tall. At the next rung is Form 3, and the ladder extends infinitely upward, never reaching a final rung, never grounding the explanation. And climbing the ladder does not bring us closer to understanding tallness, only pushes the question higher. And the third man argument shows that Plato's theory is a ladder to nowhere, is an explanatory structure that generates infinite regress rather than providing genuine explanation. One response to the third man argument, a response Plato himself may have considered, denies that forms have the properties they explain, denies that the form of tallness is itself tall, argues that forms are paradigms, are perfect standards, but do not instantiate the properties they ground. And the form of tallness is not tall, but is what tallness is the nature of tallness. And particulars are tall by resembling the form, but the form does not resemble itself, does not participate in itself. And this blocks the regress because there is no need to explain why the form and the particulars are both tall. The form is not tall, and only particulars are tall, and the regress does not start. And this response requires distinguishing between being a property and instantiating a property, requires that forms be properties without having properties. And this is metaphysically subtle, requires careful formulation. Another response accepts that forms instantiate themselves, accepts that the form of tallness is tall, but denies that this requires further explanation, denies that the form and particulars being tall needs to be explained by a higher form, argues that the form is self-explanatory, is the ground of tallness, and the fact that the form is tall is not a further fact requiring explanation, but is constitutive of what the form is, and this response blocks the regress by denying the premise that all similarity requires explanation, allows that some similarity is primitive, is not explained by further forms, and the form of tallness being tall is primitive, grounds other tallness, but does not itself need grounding. A third response from Aristotle's own position rejects Plato's separate forms entirely, argues that universals exist in particulars not in a separate realm, and tallness exists in tall men, is immanent, not transcendent. And this avoids the third man regress because there is no separate form that is itself tall. Forms are not separate entities but are aspects of particulars, and the regress does not arise because there is no form that shares the property with particulars. And Aristotle's immanent realism avoids the third man argument by changing the metaphysical location of universals, putting them in the world rather than in a separate realm. The third man argument has influenced debates about universals throughout history, has been revived and refined, has been applied to various theories of properties, and the argument shows that any theory that posits entities to explain resemblance must be careful not to make those entities instances of what they explain, must avoid the structure that generates regress, and modern theories of properties, trope theories, and resemblance nominalism and immanent realism all have been shaped by the need to avoid the third man regress. All have been designed to explain properties without generating infinite hierarchies. The argument also appears in discussions of sets and classes, because Russell's paradox is structurally similar, asks whether the set of all sets that do not contain themselves contains itself, and generates contradiction, and avoiding Russell's paradox requires type theory or other restrictions that prevent sets from being members of themselves, and these restrictions are analogous to the restrictions needed to avoid the third man argument, are ways of preventing entities from falling under their own domain, and both paradoxes show that self-reference creates problems, creates regress or contradiction, and metaphysical theories must be structured to avoid self-application. Plato's forms stand in the realm of perfect ideas, tall and beautiful and just, and the particular men stand in the physical world, tall by participation in forms, and the third man appears. the need for a second form to explain why the first form and the men are similar. And then the fourth man, the fifth, infinite, regress, and Aristotle's argument stands, devastating and elegant, showing that Plato's theory contains internal incoherence, generates infinite regress, and cannot provide the explanation it promises. And the third man argument endures as one of the most famous arguments in ancient philosophy, an argument that shaped the development of metaphysics, influenced all subsequent theories of universals, and remains a permanent challenge to any theory that posits abstract entities to explain similarity. And the third man waits, hovering above the first and second, and the regress continues, and Plato's theory falters, and the argument persists. The swampman paradox. Lightning strikes a swamp, and in that instant a man walking through the marsh is vaporized, his body reduced to scattered atoms. And by an extraordinary coincidence, the same lightning strike rearranges nearby organic matter into an exact duplicate of the man, molecule for molecule, synapse for synapse, every memory and personality trait perfectly replicated by chance. And this duplicate, called Swampman by philosopher Donald Davidson, who devised the thought experiment, opens his eyes and continues walking, unaware that anything has happened, believing himself to be the man who entered the swamp moments before. The question that follows is unsettling. Is Swampman the same person as the man who was destroyed? And if not, then what is he? Does he have thoughts, beliefs, desires? Or are his internal states merely physical patterns that resemble mental states without actually being mental states? And this paradox strikes at theories of meaning, content, and personal identity, revealing tensions between physical and historical criteria for mental properties. Davidson argued that Swampman does not have thoughts or beliefs, at least not initially, because the content of mental states depends on causal history, on how those states were formed through interaction with the environment and the linguistic community, and Swampman has no history, no past interactions, no causal connections to the world. His brain states are physically identical to the original man's, but they lack the historical grounding that gives those states their meaning. And so when Swampman seems to think about his wife, he is not actually thinking about anyone, because his internal states have no reference, no connection to the people and things they superficially resemble. This position reflects a broader externalist view in philosophy of mind, the idea that mental content is not determined solely by what is inside the head, but also by external relations, by the history of how beliefs and concepts were acquired, by the environment in which the organism evolved and learned, and so two physically identical beings could have different mental contents, or one could have mental contents while the other has none, depending on their causal histories. Others find this conclusion absurd, arguing that if Swampman is physically identical to the original man, then he must have the same mental states, that consciousness and thought supervene on physical structure, that duplicating the brain duplicates the mind, and that causal history, while perhaps relevant to the origin of mental content, is not necessary for its presence at a given moment. And so Swampman thinks and believes and desires just as the original man did. And any theory that denies this is privileging abstract historical facts over concrete present reality. The Swampman paradox also raises questions about personal identity. If Swampman is not the original man, then he is a distinct person who happens to have identical memories and personality, but those memories are false. They are not his memories because he did not live through the events they seem to record. He came into existence mere seconds ago with a fabricated past, and yet, from the inside, from Swampman's perspective, everything feels continuous and real, and he has no way of discovering the truth about his origins. And this suggests that memory and subjective continuity may be insufficient for personal identity. That being the same person requires some kind of physical or causal continuity that Swampman lacks. The paradox connects to debates about functionalism in philosophy of mind. the view that mental states are defined by their functional roles, by what they do and how they interact with other states, rather than by their physical composition or history. And functionalism seems to imply that Swampman does have mental states because his brain plays the same functional roles as the original man's brain, and yet this conflicts with externalist intuitions about content. The Swampman thought experiment has been used to explore issues in semantics, the philosophy of language, and theories of reference, showing that our ordinary assumptions about meaning and thought are more complex and fragile than they appear, that the relationship between words and world, between inner states and outer reality, is mediated by history and causation in ways that a snapshot of physical structure cannot capture. Swampman walks through the swamp, indistinguishable from the man who died, living a life that feels real, engaging in actions that seem meaningful, and yet, according to some theories, he is hollow, a zombie of sorts, a being without genuine content, without real thoughts, a perfect imitation of a person who is not quite a person, and the paradox lingers as a question about what makes mental states meaningful, what grounds reference and belief, and whether the inside of the mind is sufficient to constitute a mind, or whether minds require roots in history, connections to the world, threads of causation that link present thoughts to past experiences in ways that brute physical similarity cannot replace. The stadium paradox. Zeno of Elea constructed another puzzle about motion, one less famous than his other paradoxes, but perhaps more perplexing, and this is the stadium paradox, sometimes called the moving rows paradox, a thought experiment involving 3 rows of objects moving past each other that seems to prove that half a moment equals a whole moment, that time itself is inconsistent. Imagine 3 rows of objects arranged in a stadium, each row containing the same number of objects. Let us say 4 objects in each row for simplicity, and the first row remains stationary, while the second row moves to the right and the third row moves to the left, each moving at the same speed. At the starting moment, the rows are aligned, but after 1 unit of time, the second row has moved 1 position to the right and the third row has moved 1 position to the left. And here is where the paradox emerges. From the perspective of the stationary first row, each moving row has passed 1 object, but from the perspective of the second row moving right, the third row moving left has passed 2 objects. Because the relative motion between the second and third rows is twice as fast as the motion of either row relative to the stationary row. Zeno argued that this leads to a contradiction, because if the smallest unit of time is the time it takes for one object to pass another, then relative to the first row, 1 unit of time has passed, but relative to the second row, 2 units of time have passed, as measured by how many objects of the third row have gone by. And so the same interval is both 1 unit and 2 units, half of itself and equal to itself, and time becomes incoherent. The paradox is more difficult to grasp than Zeno's other arguments, and even ancient commentators struggled to articulate exactly what the problem was supposed to be, and Aristotle's response was somewhat dismissive, pointing out that the speed of an object depends on the frame of reference, that there is no absolute motion, but only motion relative to other objects, and that the time it takes to pass an object in motion is different from the time it takes to pass a stationary object, and therefore there is no contradiction, merely a confusion about relative velocities. Modern physics has vindicated Aristotle's intuition through the principle of relativity, which states that the laws of physics are the same in all inertial reference frames, and that there is no privileged stationary frame. All motion is relative, and the speed at which objects pass each other depends on the observer's frame of reference. Yet some interpreters suggest that Zeno's stadium paradox was actually an early glimpse of the relativity of motion, an attempt to show that if motion is real, then there can be no absolute measure of speed or time, and that this was meant to support Parmenides' claim that motion is an illusion. Others argue that the paradox reveals an implicit assumption about the discrete nature of space and time, that Zeno may have been imagining space as a grid of discrete positions and time as a sequence of discrete moments, and that the paradox arises from trying to reconcile continuous motion with discrete structure, a tension that would not be fully addressed until the development of calculus and later quantum mechanics. The paradox also touches on the concept of relative velocity, the idea that the speed of one object relative to another is the sum of their individual speeds if they are moving in opposite directions, and that this is perfectly consistent even though it means different observers measure different relative speeds. In a sense, the stadium paradox is less about motion itself and more about the consistency of measurement, the question of whether time and space have absolute units or whether all measurements are relative to the observer. And this question would not be fully answered until Einstein's theories of special and general relativity in the 20th century, which showed that time itself is not absolute, but depends on the relative motion and gravitational fields of the observer. Zeno's stadium sits quietly in the history of philosophy, overshadowed by his more famous paradoxes, yet it contains within it the seeds of ideas that would take 2,000 years to fully develop: the relativity of motion, the frame dependence of measurement, the question of whether space and time are discrete or continuous, and the paradox remains a reminder that even the simplest scenarios, 3 rows of objects moving past each other, can conceal deep questions about the nature of reality, questions that our intuitions cannot easily answer, questions that require centuries of thought and mathematics to even begin to unravel. The skeptical paradox. The ancient skeptics posed a question that has haunted philosophy ever since. How can we know anything at all? How can we justify our beliefs about the external world when those beliefs rest on foundations that are themselves uncertain, when every justification requires further justification in an endless regress? And this is the skeptical paradox, the problem that knowledge seems both necessary for action and impossible to achieve, that we cannot help but believe and claim to know, yet we cannot provide the kind of justification that would ground those claims in certainty. The skeptical argument takes many forms. One of the most powerful begins with the observation that our beliefs about the external world are based on sensory experience. We believe there is a table in front of us because we see it and touch it. But sensory experience can be misleading. Illusions and hallucinations occur. Dreams feel real while we are dreaming them. And so the mere fact that we have a certain experience does not guarantee that the world is as the experience represents it. And this means that our sensory experiences underdetermine our beliefs about the world. The same experiences could be produced by a real table, by a hallucination, by a detailed dream, or by a Cartesian demon systematically deceiving us. And if we cannot rule out these skeptical scenarios, then we cannot know that the table is real, and this reasoning applies to all our beliefs about the external world. None of them are certain. All are vulnerable to skeptical doubt. The skeptic does not claim to know that we are deceived, only that we cannot know we are not deceived. And this is enough to undermine knowledge, because knowledge seems to require not just true belief, but justified true belief. And justification seems to require being able to rule out relevant alternatives. And the skeptical scenarios are relevant alternatives that we cannot rule out, at least not without begging the question, not without assuming the very thing we are trying to prove, that our senses are reliable, that the external world exists, that we are not dreaming or deceived. The skeptical paradox is that we seem to have 2 incompatible intuitions. On the one hand, we are convinced that we know many things, that we know there is a table in front of us, that we know we have hands, that we know the earth is round, and these beliefs seem as certain as anything could be. And on the other hand, we find the skeptical arguments compelling. We recognize that we cannot prove we are not deceived, that the possibility of systematic error cannot be ruled out by any non-circular reasoning. And so, we oscillate between certainty and doubt, between the conviction that skepticism is absurd and the recognition that we cannot refute it. Descartes attempted to escape skepticism through his method of doubt, doubting everything that could be doubted until he reached the indubitable foundation, cogito ergo sum. I think therefore I am, the one truth that even the most radical skepticism cannot undermine, because to doubt that one exists is to presuppose that there is someone doing the doubting. And from this foundation, Descartes tried to rebuild knowledge, proving the existence of God and using God's benevolence to guarantee the reliability of clear and distinct perceptions. But few philosophers have found this reconstruction convincing. The arguments for God's existence are controversial, and even if successful, they would not close the gap between subjective certainty and objective truth, between what seems clear and what actually is. Hume took skepticism more seriously, arguing that we have no rational justification for believing in causation, induction, or the existence of an external world, that these beliefs are products of custom and habit rather than reason, that we believe because we cannot help but believe, because our psychology compels us, not because we have good arguments. And Hume distinguished between philosophical skepticism, the theoretical position that knowledge is impossible, and practical certainty, the psychological inevitability of belief and action. And he suggested that we can acknowledge the force of skeptical arguments in the study while setting them aside in ordinary life. Though this division between theory and practice remains uncomfortable, a kind of intellectual schizophrenia where we admit that our beliefs are unjustified, yet continue to hold them anyway. Kant responded to Hume by arguing that skepticism rests on a mistake, the assumption that knowledge requires correspondence between our representations and things as they are in themselves, independent of our cognitive faculties, and Kant argued that this assumption is incoherent, that we can only know things as they appear to us, as structured by the forms of intuition and the categories of understanding, and that the question of how things are independently of these structures is meaningless, not answerable even in principle, and so skepticism about the external world is based on a confused demand, a demand for a kind of knowledge that is conceptually impossible, and Kant's transcendental idealism attempts to secure the objectivity of knowledge by relativizing it to the conditions of possible experience, making knowledge possible by making it more modest, more limited, no longer claiming to grasp things in themselves, but only things as they appear within the framework of human cognition. Contemporary epistemology has developed various responses to skepticism. Externalist theories argue that knowledge does not require the ability to rule out all skeptical scenarios, that knowledge requires only that beliefs be produced by reliable processes or track the truth in certain ways. And on these views we can know we have hands, even if we cannot prove we are not brains in vats. Because in the actual world, our perceptual beliefs are reliably formed, and the fact that we cannot distinguish the actual world from a skeptical scenario does not undermine knowledge as long as we are in fact in the actual world, and our beliefs are in fact reliably formed. Contextualist theories argue that the standards for knowledge vary with context, that in ordinary contexts skeptical scenarios are not relevant, and we can truly claim to know many things, while in philosophical contexts where skeptical scenarios are explicitly raised, the standards become more demanding and knowledge claims become false. And this allows us to preserve both the intuition that we know many things in everyday life, and the intuition that skeptical arguments are powerful in philosophical inquiry, by treating these as claims about knowledge in different contexts with different standards. The skeptical paradox remains unresolved. No consensus has emerged about how to respond to skeptical arguments, and different philosophers find different responses more or less satisfying depending on their broader commitments about the nature of knowledge, justification, and the mind's relationship to the world. And the paradox continues to drive epistemological theorizing, forcing philosophers to clarify what they mean by knowledge, what conditions must be met for a belief to count as knowledge, and whether the concept of knowledge we ordinarily employ is coherent or whether it contains internal tensions that cannot be fully resolved. The skeptic sits in doubt, questioning everything, unable to claim knowledge, yet unable to stop believing, and the rest of us navigates between confidence and uncertainty, acting as if we know, while acknowledging in quieter moments that our knowledge rests on foundations that are less secure than we would like, that the gap between appearance and reality cannot be fully closed, that the possibility of error cannot be eliminated, and that knowledge, if it exists at all, is more fragile and more difficult to achieve than common sense suggests. And the paradox endures, the ancient puzzle that will not die, the question that philosophy cannot answer but cannot stop asking, and we continue to believe, to claim to know, to act with confidence, while the skeptic watches and waits, reminding us that certainty is elusive, that doubt is always possible, that the foundations of knowledge are shakier than they appear. The two-envelope paradox. A game is presented, two sealed envelopes sit before you, each containing money, and you are told that one envelope contains twice as much money as the other, but you do not know which is which, and you're allowed to choose one envelope, open it, examine the amount inside, and then decide whether to keep it or switch to the other envelope. And this simple setup leads to a paradox that has puzzled decision theorists and mathematicians for decades, because the reasoning seems to suggest you should always switch envelopes, no matter what amount you find. And yet this conclusion is absurd because switching cannot systematically improve your outcome in a symmetric situation. Suppose you open your envelope and find $100 inside, and now you reason as follows. The other envelope contains either $50 or $200, each with equal probability, and so the expected value of switching is the average of those two amounts, which is $125, more than the $100 you currently have, and therefore you should switch. But this reasoning applies no matter what amount you find in the first envelope, whether it is $10 or $1 million. And so it seems you should always switch, but this cannot be right because before opening any envelope, the two envelopes are symmetric. Neither is better than the other, and so there cannot be a strategy that consistently favors one over the other. The paradox reveals a subtle error in the reasoning. The mistake lies in the assumption that the other envelope is equally likely to contain half or double the amount in the first envelope, because this treats the two possibilities as symmetric when they are not. If the two envelope amounts were determined in advance, say $50 and $100, then finding $100 in the first envelope tells you with certainty that the other contains 50, not that it might contain 200, and the probability calculation breaks down because it fails to account for the constraints imposed by the setup. Another way to see the problem is to notice that the same reasoning would tell you to switch back after switching, creating an infinite loop of switching, which is clearly absurd. And this shows that something is wrong with the expected value calculation, though pinpointing exactly what is wrong has led to extensive debate. Some argue that the paradox arises from improper use of probability in cases where the amounts are determined but unknown, that assigning equal probability to the two possibilities is not justified without more information about how the amounts were chosen. Others point to issues with unbounded utility, suggesting that if there is no upper limit on how much money the envelopes might contain, then expected value calculations can behave strangely and lead to paradoxes. The two-envelope paradox also appears in game theory and economics, where it illustrates the danger of reasoning about probabilities without carefully specifying the underlying probability distribution, and it connects to broader puzzles about decision-making under uncertainty, such as the St. Petersburg paradox and the principle of indifference. Some versions of the paradox introduce additional twists. Suppose you open one envelope, see the amount, and are then allowed to pay a small fee to switch. Would it be rational to pay? And how much would you be willing to pay? And these variations expose tensions between different decision theories, between evidential and causal reasoning, between maximizing expected value and following dominance principles. The paradox remains a teaching tool in probability and decision theory, a cautionary tale about the risks of applying mathematical reasoning mechanically without understanding the full structure of the problem, and it reminds us that even simple games with clear rules can generate confusion when probabilities and expectations are involved. That intuition is an unreliable guide in matters of chance, and that the formalism of mathematics, while powerful, must be applied with care to avoid generating conclusions that seem compelling but are ultimately incoherent. And the two envelopes sit there, sealed and symmetrical, each containing money, and the temptation to switch, to reason that the other must be better, to calculate expected values and probabilities, leads into a trap from which logic alone struggles to escape. The tragedy of the commons: why shared resources destroy themselves. A village shares a common pasture, open to all herders, and each herder can graze their animals freely, can use the resource without restriction, and each herder reasons individually, calculates privately that adding one more animal to their herd brings them full benefit, brings them more milk and meat and wealth, while the cost of overgrazing is shared among all herders, is distributed across the community, and so each herder gains fully from expansion but pays only a fraction of the cost. And this asymmetry, this structure of incentives, drives each rational herder to add more animals, to maximize their individual benefit, and every herder reasons this way. Every herder expands their herd, and the commons becomes overgrazed, becomes depleted, becomes destroyed. And what was a productive shared resource becomes barren, becomes useless to everyone. And this is the tragedy of the commons, described by Garrett Hardin in 1968. A pattern where individually rational decisions lead to collective disaster, where the pursuit of self-interest in using shared resources results in the destruction of those resources. And the tragedy applies not just to grazing pastures, but to fisheries that are overfished, to aquifers that are depleted, to atmospheres that are polluted, to any shared resource where individual benefits are private but costs are collective. And the tragedy reveals a fundamental problem in resource management, shows that voluntary restraint is insufficient, shows that without collective governance, shared resources tend toward destruction, and solving the tragedy requires institutions, requires mechanisms that align individual incentives with collective sustainability. Imagine the herder's calculation more precisely. The commons can sustain a certain number of animals, and beyond that capacity, the pasture degrades, produces less grass, supports fewer animals, and when operating below capacity, each additional animal brings net benefit to its owner without significant cost to others. But when operating at or above capacity, each additional animal brings benefit to its owner while imposing costs on all herders through degradation. And the individual herder receives the full benefit, receives all the milk and meat from their additional animal, but pays only their proportional share of the degradation cost. And if there are 10 herders, then each pays 1/10 of the degradation cost. And so the individual benefit exceeds the individual cost, even when the collective cost exceeds the collective benefit. And this creates the incentive structure that drives the tragedy, that makes it individually rational to add animals even when doing so harms the collective. And every herder faces this incentive. Every herder adds animals, and the commons collapses under the weight of rational individual decisions. The tragedy of the commons demonstrates the difference between individual and collective rationality, shows that actions can be rational from an individual perspective, while being disastrous from a collective perspective. And this divergence is the core of the tragedy, is what makes the situation tragic rather than merely unfortunate. And the tragedy is not caused by irrationality or malice, but by rational pursuit of self-interest, in a context where individual and collective interests misalign. And Hardin's insight was that this misalignment is structural. is inherent in the nature of common pool resources and cannot be solved by appeals to conscience or voluntary restraint, because any individual who restrains themselves while others do not simply sacrifices their own benefit without saving the commons. And this creates a race to the bottom, creates pressure to exploit resources before others do, and the tragedy unfolds inevitably unless institutions intervene. Visualize the tragedy as a multiplayer prisoner's dilemma, where each individual faces the choice between restraint, limiting their use of the commons for collective benefit, or exploitation, maximizing their individual use at collective cost. And exploitation dominates restraint, because regardless of what others do, you are better off exploiting. If others restrain themselves, you benefit from the preserved commons while taking more than your share. And if others exploit, then the commons is doomed anyway, and restraint only makes you worse off relative to others. And so everyone exploits. Everyone takes more than sustainable, and the commons is destroyed. And this structure shows that the tragedy is a coordination problem, is a failure to achieve collective action, and solving it requires changing the incentive structure, requires making restraint individually rational, and this can be achieved through various mechanisms, through private property that internalizes costs, through regulation that enforces limits, through community management that creates monitoring and sanctions, through taxation that makes exploitation costly. One response to the tragedy is privatization, converting commons into private property, assigning ownership to individuals who then bear the full costs and benefits of their decisions. And private owners have incentive to manage sustainably, because degradation reduces the value of their property. And this aligns individual and collective interests, makes conservation individually rational. And historical examples exist of commons being enclosed, being divided into private parcels. And while enclosure solves the tragedy, it raises questions of justice, of how property is assigned, of what happens to those who lose access. And privatization is not always feasible, is not appropriate for all resources, and some commons, like the atmosphere or the ocean, cannot be easily privatized, cannot be divided into individual holdings, and alternative solutions are needed. Another response is regulation, government intervention that imposes limits on use, that enforces sustainable practices through monitoring and penalties, and regulation can solve the tragedy by making exploitation illegal, by removing the incentive to overuse, and examples include fishing quotas, emission limits, grazing restrictions, and regulations can be effective when enforcement is strong, when violations are detected and punished, but regulation faces challenges, requires accurate information about sustainable use levels, requires political will to enforce, requires resistance to lobbying from those who benefit from exploitation, and regulations can be captured, can be weakened or undermined, and the tragedy can re-emerge if enforcement fails. A third response, emphasized by Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for this work, is community management, where local communities develop institutions to govern commons, create rules for use, establish monitoring systems, sanction violators, and these community-managed commons can be sustainable for long periods, can avoid tragedy through social norms, through reputation mechanisms, through collective decision-making, and Ostrom documented many examples worldwide of successful commons management, showed that neither privatization nor government regulation is necessary, that communities can self-organize to solve tragedies, and her work challenged Harden's pessimism, showed that tragedy is not inevitable, that the commons can be governed sustainably when appropriate institutions exist, and the key factors include clear boundaries defining who can use the resource, rules matched to local conditions, participation in rule-making by those affected, monitoring by accountable monitors, graduated sanctions for violations, conflict resolution mechanisms, and recognition of rights to organize by external authorities. The tragedy also applies to global commons, to resources that transcend local or national boundaries. And climate change is the paradigmatic example. The atmosphere is a global commons, and each nation benefits from emitting greenhouse gases, benefits from economic activity that produces emissions, while the costs of climate change are distributed globally, are borne by all nations. And this creates the tragedy structure, makes it individually rational for each nation to emit even when collective emissions drive catastrophic change. And solving this global tragedy requires international cooperation, requires agreements that bind nations to reduce emissions, requires mechanisms for enforcement and monitoring, and achieving such cooperation is extraordinarily difficult, requires overcoming free rider problems, requires building trust among nations with divergent interests, and the failure to adequately address climate change demonstrates the difficulty of solving tragedies at global scale, shows that the larger the commons and the more diverse the users, the harder it is to achieve collective governance. The tragedy also has temporal dimensions, affects intergenerational equity, because current overuse depletes resources for future generations, and future people cannot participate in current decisions, cannot bargain or negotiate, cannot protect their interests. And this creates an asymmetry where present benefits come at future costs, and market mechanisms and democratic processes are biased toward the present, give insufficient weight to future generations. And avoiding intergenerational tragedy requires institutional commitment to sustainability, requires valuing future welfare, requires resisting the temptation to consume resources now at the expense of those not yet born, and this is perhaps the deepest tragedy, that future people cannot defend themselves against present exploitation. The commons continues to degrade, the herders continue to add animals, the pasture becomes barren, and the tragedy unfolds, driven by rational individual decisions, driven by the misalignment of individual and collective interests, and every herder suffers, loses their livelihood, destroys what sustained them, and the tragedy remains one of the most important concepts in environmental and resource economics, remains a framework for understanding why shared resources are vulnerable, why voluntary restraint is insufficient, why institutions matter, and the tragedy applies to fisheries emptied, to aquifers drained, to forests cleared, to atmospheres polluted, and avoiding tragedy requires collective action, requires governance that aligns incentives, requires institutions that make sustainability individually rational. And without such institutions, the commons tends toward destruction, and the tragedy of the commons endures as a permanent warning about the limits of individual rationality, about the need for collective governance, and about the structural challenges in managing shared resources. The voting paradox. When adding voters changes winners impossibly. An election occurs, 3 candidates compete, and voters rank the candidates according to their preferences, and the votes are counted, and candidate A wins, receives the most support, is the clear winner. And then more voters arrive, more ballots are cast, and these new voters all rank candidate A first, all prefer A to the other candidates, all support the winner, and the votes are recounted with the additional ballots, and candidate A loses, is no longer the winner, is defeated by candidate B or C, and this seems impossible, seems to violate basic logic, seems to contradict the meaning of support. Because how can receiving additional support cause a candidate to lose? How can gaining voters result in defeat? And yet this can happen under certain voting systems, under rank choice or instant runoff systems, where voters rank candidates and losers are eliminated in rounds. And the elimination order can change when new voters are added, can cause candidates who would have been eliminated early to survive, and candidates who would have won to be eliminated. And this is the voting paradox. The demonstration that voting systems can produce inconsistent results, can violate monotonicity, can make winners lose when they gain support. And the paradox reveals that translating individual preferences into collective choices is more complex than it seems, that no voting system is perfect, that all systems have problematic properties, and the voting paradox is one of many paradoxes that arise in social choice theory, in the study of how groups make decisions, and these paradoxes show that democratic decision-making faces inherent difficulties, faces impossibilities proven by mathematical theorems, and the voting paradox remains a challenge for democratic theory, forces recognition that institutional design matters, that different voting systems produce different outcomes from the same preferences, and that choosing a voting system requires trade-offs, requires accepting some problems to avoid others. Imagine a specific example with instant runoff voting. 3 candidates A, B, C, and initially 5 voters with preferences. 2 voters prefer A, then B, then C. 2 voters prefer B, then C, then A. And 1 voter prefers C, then B, then A. And in the first round, A receives 2 first-place votes. B receives 2, C receives 1, so C is eliminated for having the fewest. And C's vote transfers to B, and B wins with 3 votes to A's 2. And now suppose 2 additional voters arrive, both ranking A first, ranking A, then C, then B, and now there are 7 voters. 4 prefer A first, and in the first round A receives 4 first-place votes. B receives 2, C receives 1, so C is eliminated again, and C's vote plus the 2 new votes that ranked C second all transfer to B. Wait, let me recalculate. The 2 new voters ranked C second, so their votes would transfer to C if A were eliminated, but A has most first-place votes, so instead B is eliminated for having fewest, and B's votes transfer based on second preferences. The original 2 B voters had C second, so those transfer to C, and now C has 3 votes to A's 4. And A wins, so actually this example shows A winning both times. Let me construct a different example. Consider instead 3 candidates and a scenario where initial votes create a situation where candidate B wins after C is eliminated and C's supporters transfer to B. But when new voters arrive supporting A, this changes the elimination order such that B is eliminated first, and B's supporters transfer to C, and C wins, defeating A despite A gaining support. And constructing specific examples requires careful attention to transfer patterns, to how second and third preferences interact with elimination orders. And the paradox is real, has been documented, has been proven possible under instant runoff and other systems. And the mathematical possibility demonstrates that monotonicity, the principle that gaining support cannot hurt a candidate, is not guaranteed by all voting systems, is violated by some systems, and this violation is paradoxical, is counterintuitive, seems to violate the meaning of winning. The voting paradox connects to Arrow's impossibility theorem, which proves that no voting system can simultaneously satisfy a set of seemingly reasonable criteria, including monotonicity, independence of irrelevant alternatives, Pareto efficiency, and non-dictatorship, and the voting paradox is one manifestation of this impossibility, is one way that voting systems fail to satisfy all desirable properties. And Arrow's theorem shows that the paradox is not a defect of particular voting systems, but is an inherent feature of aggregating preferences. It is an unavoidable trade-off, and different voting systems make different trade-offs, prioritize different properties, and the paradox shows that monotonicity is one property that some systems sacrifice. And choosing a voting system requires deciding which properties are most important, which failures are most acceptable. Visualize the voting paradox as revealing path dependence, where the outcome depends not just on preferences but on the order in which candidates are eliminated, on the sequence of decisions, and adding voters changes. This sequence changes which candidates survive to later rounds. And this path dependence creates opportunities for paradoxes, creates situations where gaining support can hurt because it changes the path, changes who is eliminated when. And this shows that voting outcomes are not simply determined by preferences, but are mediated by procedures. by the specific rules used to aggregate preferences, and different rules produce different outcomes. One response to the voting paradox is to abandon instant runoff voting, to use systems that do not exhibit non-monotonicity and plurality voting, where the candidate with most first-place votes wins without elimination rounds, satisfies monotonicity. Gaining votes always helps under plurality, but plurality has other problems, has spoiler effects, can elect candidates opposed by majorities, and so while plurality avoids the voting paradox, it faces different paradoxes, different failures, and no system is paradox-free, and the choice is between different sets of problems. Another response is to accept that monotonicity, violations are rare, are unlikely in practice, require specific configurations of preferences, and while the voting paradox is possible, it is improbable, and instant runoff voting performs well on average. Despite theoretical problems, and empirical studies of actual elections using instant runoff find few, if any, cases of monotonicity violations, find that the paradox is more theoretical than practical, and this response prioritizes actual performance over theoretical properties, accepts that systems can be good enough even if not perfect. An instant runoff may be good enough despite the voting paradox. A third response develops approval voting or score voting systems, where voters can express intensity of preference, can give multiple candidates approval or give candidates numerical scores. And these systems have different properties, avoid some paradoxes while potentially creating others. And approval voting satisfies monotonicity. Gaining approval always helps, but approval voting faces strategic voting problems. Voters must decide which candidates to approve. An optimal strategy depends on expectations about others' votes, and this strategic complexity is a different kind of problem, and no system eliminates all difficulties. The voting paradox also raises questions about the meaning of winning, about what it means for a candidate to have majority support, and the paradox shows that winning is system relative, is defined by the voting rules, and different rules define winning differently. And a candidate can be a winner under one system and a loser under another, even with the same preferences. And this challenges the idea that elections reveal a determinate will of the people, suggests that collective will is constructed by voting procedures rather than simply discovered, and different procedures construct different collective wills. And this has implications for democratic legitimacy, for understanding what elections achieve. And some argue that the paradox undermines electoral legitimacy, shows that election outcomes are arbitrary, are dependent on rules rather than reflecting genuine popular preferences, while others argue that the paradox shows only that rule choice matters, that democracy requires choosing rules wisely, but that elections can still be legitimate, even if different rules would produce different outcomes. The election is held, votes are counted, and candidate A wins, and more votes arrive supporting A, and votes are recounted, and A loses, and the paradox emerges, impossible but real, proven but counterintuitive, and the voting paradox stands as one of many paradoxes. In social choice theory, stands as evidence that aggregating preferences is complex, is not simply a matter of counting, but involves trade-offs, involves accepting some problems to avoid others. And the paradox shows that no voting system is perfect, that Arrow's impossibility theorem is not merely theoretical, but has practical manifestations, and the voting paradox remains relevant for democratic design, for choosing electoral systems, for understanding the limits of voting, and the paradox endures. Berry's paradox. Language allows us to describe numbers in various ways, and some descriptions are short while others are long, and this leads to a curious question posed by G.G. Berry and later popularized by Bertrand Russell. What is the smallest positive integer that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words? And the moment this question is asked, the paradox appears. The phrase itself, the smallest positive integer that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words, is a description, and counting the words reveals that it contains only 13 words, which means it describes a number in fewer than 20 words. But the number it describes is supposed to be the smallest number that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words, and so a contradiction emerges. If such a number exists, then it has just been described in 13 words, which means it can be described in fewer than 20 words, which means it does not meet the criteria of being a number that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words, and therefore it cannot be the number the phrase claims it is. And yet the phrase clearly picks out some specific number, and that number must exist somewhere in the infinite sequence of integers. The paradox reveals a deep tension between language and mathematics, between the finite tools of description and the infinite objects those tools attempt to capture, and it suggests that not all mathematical objects can be uniquely specified using the resources of natural language. Berry's paradox is closely related to Richard's paradox and other semantic paradoxes that arise when language tries to refer to itself or to its own limitations, and it played a role in early 20th century debates about the foundations of mathematics, particularly in discussions about definability and the limits of formal systems. Some logicians argue that the phrase "the smallest positive integer that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words" is simply ill-formed, that it does not successfully refer to any number at all because its definition is self-contradictory, much like the set of all sets that do not contain themselves fails to be a coherent set. Others suggest that the paradox arises from an ambiguity in what it means to describe a number, that descriptions exist within formal languages with specific rules, and that mixing informal natural language with formal mathematical definitions creates confusion. Alfred Tarski's work on truth and definability offers one way to resolve the paradox by distinguishing between levels of language, separating the language used to describe numbers from the meta-language used to describe descriptions, and showing that paradoxes like Berry's emerge when these levels are improperly conflated. The paradox also touches on questions about computability and algorithmic complexity, because if a number cannot be described in fewer than a certain number of words, it might also be incomputable or irreducibly complex, existing beyond the reach of any finite algorithm. Berry's paradox lingers as a reminder that language, for all its power, is not unlimited, that there are numbers and truths that slip through the gaps in description, that the map is not the territory and can never fully be, and that even something as seemingly concrete as a positive integer can become strange and elusive when definitions turn inward and try to grasp themselves.